presenting neuroevolution, and in particular an algorithm called NEAT. And I will not be going into present mode because my screen recorder doesn't play well with that, so I'll keep it like this. So before going into neuroevolution, I want to go over some more common methods of learning in machine learning. So there's supervised learning, where you're learning off of labeled data, and you're doing backpropagation and gradient descent off of that labeled data. There's unsupervised, where you're finding patterns in unlabeled data, so for example clustering. So you're not necessarily trying to find classifications, but rather structure or patterns in data. And then reinforcement learning, where the goal isn't necessarily to even be analyzing data at all, but rather you have an agent in an environment, and the goal is to maximize the agent's performance, and that's usually measured by some kind of reward signal. So one arguably fourth method of learning is called neuroevolution. And in terms of the goal of neuroevolution and its abilities, they are very similar to that of reinforcement learning, where you have an agent that's acting in an environment and is trying to maximize its performance in the environment. But the way it does that is very, very different. So whereas in RL, typically you have one agent and you train that one agent, neuroevolution works with populations, so 50 to 100 to even thousands of different models rather than just one. Neuroevolution does not use standard gradient descent techniques like backpropagation. And this is the biggest one. Neuroevolution is inspired by biological evolution and uses techniques like breeding, speciation, mutation, and natural selection to optimize its population of solutions over time. So this is just like a general overview. So first you evaluate your population and see how well each one does in the problem you're trying to solve. Then you select the best, you breed those top performers, that becomes your new population, and then that is repeated. But as we'll see in later slides, this is a bit more nuanced than this graphic shows. So NEAT is one specific algorithm in neuroevolution. It stands for Neuroevolution of Augmenting Topologies. And the basic overview of how it works is you start with a population. You run that population in an environment and get a fitness score for each solution. And I'll go more into depth about this later. Then you separate the population into species. You eliminate the worst performing members of the population and you breed the top performing members. And iterating this process should slowly better the population over time, eventually converging on a population that is relatively good at solving the problem. And this augmenting topologies part of the name is very important because this means that the structure of the networks is changing over time. So it's not just optimizing the weights or the parameters of the network, you're actually changing the structure, like the nodes and the different connections from each node. And the structure is also arbitrary. So whereas in traditional neural networks you have matrices, organized matrices that can represent organized layers, neural networks in NEAT don't have these organized layers and have much more arbitrary structures, which you'll see later. So just to sort of motivate what NEAT can do, here's a short clip of it playing more
at first, but don't worry, I'll help break it.
So you can see that it's pretty good at dodging obstacles and getting through the level. And what I want you to focus on is this top part right here, and it looks like a mess. But this is the neural network. This is what's operating Mario here. And you can see right off the bat, it doesn't look like your standard deep neural network. You don't see the nice, neat layers. You kind of see connections and nodes all over the place. And this is what I meant by arbitrary topologies. You don't necessarily have these organized layers. You can have as many or as little neurons in different places. And you'll also notice that not even all the inputs in the input space are connected. So this the square here has a lot of pixels, but over through evolution has decided ultimately which inputs are important and which can be ignored. And so this really helps optimize learning because over time the networks are deciding what's actually important for themselves and what is not. So just to step through the process now, first we start with a population. So although there isn't much information here, what's important to note is that this population is uniform, meaning every single network is the same. Well, not exactly the same. They have the same structure, so there's no hidden nodes, it's just inputs and outputs. So there's no hidden nodes, and the weights are randomly initialized. And the reason why we start with a population with no hidden nodes is because the goal of NEAT is, and I'll add like a text box here, to start with minimal structure and only add structure if necessary. So this way, whatever the end result is, whatever you get after, let's say, 50 generations, you know that evolution has, you know that the models in your population only have certain pieces of structure because evolution deemed that structure to be necessary. So whereas you have all of these nodes and you don't necessarily know if every single one is being utilized, here you only add nodes if they're completely necessary, and you only add connections if they're completely necessary. And in some implementations of NEAT, you don't even have these connections initialized. At the beginning you set them to be disabled, and then evolution will decide if it's necessary to enable those connections. And the population is not represented, well, these neural networks are not represented in the traditional way that a deep neural network might be represented. So, as I said before, DNNs are typically represented by matrices because that's the most efficient way to represent them. But because our networks are going to have arbitrary topologies like this, it's basically impossible to represent it within a matrix. So we represent the nodes and the connections linearly with a genome. So within the genome you have node genes and connection genes, and the node genes just list out what nodes there are and whether they're input, whether they are an input node, hidden node, or output node. And then you have a list of connections going from one node to another. So it's important to note what information is actually stored within the connection genes. So connection genes tell you what the input and the output node is, what the weight of the node is, whether the connection is enabled or disabled, and the innovation number of the connection. So in NEAT neural networks, the connections can be enabled or disabled. So if it's disabled, then it's as if the connection doesn't exist, there's no information carried through it, and it does not contribute to the output in any way. And if it's enabled, then it works just like a normal weight. Now this innovation number here is actually very important, and I'll talk about it in the next slide. So innovation numbers serve two purposes. One, they maintain a gene's origin throughout evolution. So every time a new gene is added through mutations, the innovation number is incremented by 1 and is given to that gene. So if we add a connection, from, let's say, node 3 to node 5, that's given the new innovation number of 7. Here, if we add a node, adding a node is equivalent to splitting a connection and adding 2 new connections. So we increment that to be 8 and 9. And notice we go to 8 because we've already incremented 7 here. So the innovation numbers are global, meaning that they are the innovation numbers are global, meaning that they're incremented throughout evolution and they're saved throughout evolution. And what's important about innovation numbers is that if a gene pops up that NEAT has seen before, so let's say we have node 1, 2, and 3. So for our connections, this first connection will get innovation number 1, and this second connection at the bottom will get innovation number 2. Okay, and this connects nodes 1 to 3, 1, 2, 3, and this connects nodes 2 to 3. And let's say we add a new node. So adding a new node is equivalent to just splitting a connection, because we can't add a new node off in space, we have to put it on a connection. So if we add a new node here, this is node number 4. We have 2 new connections here, and that gets, so that's 3 and that's 4. And the original connection going from 1 to 3, 1 to 3 is disabled. So these get innovation numbers 3 and 4. So let's say we create a new network in the population. Okay, 2, 3. Because a connection from 1 to 3 already exists, because we've already seen this gene before, this gets the same innovation number of 1 to 3. And then 2 to 3 we've also seen before, and this gets the innovation number of 2. And again, if we add a new node and we happen to split the same connection, then it'll have the same innovation number. And what's important about this is that now NEAT knows that these are structurally the same networks because they have the same innovation numbers. So it doesn't have to do anything complicated like tracing the connections or nodes or anything like that. It can just look at the innovation numbers and know that these two networks are the same structurally. So innovation numbers are a way of representing a network structure and a way of comparing two networks and their structure. And this will be very, very helpful for crossover later on. So now let's talk about fitness scores. So fitness score is very simple. It's merely a way of evaluating a network and scoring it, giving it a score based on how well it did in its environment. So in an RL or reinforcement learning environment, this would be equivalent to the reward. So for example, if we were creating a NEAT AI in Flappy Bird, we could go off the number of pipes that the bird passed as the fitness. And obviously, higher, more fit individuals in a population are favored for reproduction, whereas the ones that get lower fitnesses are going to be eliminated later on. So once we've established our population, encoded our population into genomes, and actually ran our population within an environment and evaluated them with a fitness score, we move on to speciation. So speciation is a way of promoting diversity of solutions within a population while still maintaining quality. And this is another important innovation of the NEAT algorithm that other ones before it did not have. So if I just open a new one, so if we were to just go off of this population right here and just eliminate like the worst half and then breed the best half, and then go by basically what this graphic here said, this would raise the fitness every generation and would eventually converge on a solution that's good. But the problem is that evolution might find one specific structure that it favors. And eventually, because that structure is doing so well in the population, what could happen is that one structure becomes, that the entire population becomes just that one structure. And at that point, you've lost all diversity, and your entire population is uniform. And the problem with this is that once your population settles on just one specific solution, is that your evolution is done. You have nowhere else to go. There's no other innovation that you can do, and this is problematic for more complicated problems where you're going to need to optimize for long periods of time. So speciation allows us to separate networks into their own species based on how structurally similar they are, and then these networks will breed and reproduce within their own species, so these species are maintained throughout each generation. And again, this allows us to keep some amount of diversity as a constant throughout evolution. So for example, here are two examples of species. So you can see these three are very similar in structure, except for minor differences in weights, and same thing here. And to actually separate these into species, there's a threshold that is used when comparing two different networks. So there's basically two questions that are asked by NEAT. Do these two networks have similar weights, and do they have a similar structure? And this structure here is measured once again by, do they have similar innovation numbers? So once we've established our species, we eliminate the bottom portion of each species. And again, if we were to just keep a population like this and eliminate the bottom half of the population, we would be losing a lot of diversity each generation, and eventually we would converge on just one solution. Whereas here, we're maintaining different structures throughout evolution, and we're optimizing different structures, and this allows for a diversity of solutions. And when you eliminate the bottom half, this should automatically raise the average fitness, just due to math. So if you have fitnesses of 0 to 80, eliminating this bottom half right here and keeping this top half would dramatically raise the average fitness. And then once we eliminate the worst, we have to cross over the best. So this can be done, this is made much easier by the innovation numbers. So you line up the genes using the innovation numbers and pick a random gene for each innovation between the two parents. So for example, here are two examples of neural networks in NEAT. So this one has innovation numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 8. It's missing 6 through 7. This has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. and then you just line up the innovations, so 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3, and so on, and then the genes in one parent that do not have a pair in the other parent are called disjoint genes if they're located in the middle, and ones that are on the outside are called excess genes. And these disjoint and excess genes are also another way that you can detect differences in structure between two networks, and it's another way that these networks are separated into species. So breeding is as simple as just choosing one random gene, so flipping a coin and choosing one of these to pass down to the child. And in terms of disjoint and excess genes, these are just automatically put in or are randomly selected as well. And then here you can see that our child looks very similar to both parent 2 and parent 1, so it has received all the necessary information it needs from both parents thanks to these innovation numbers. So now that I've gone over the basic process of how NEAT works, I want to go over more into its achievements. So NEAT outperformed many other neuroevolution and reinforcement learning algorithms in Atari. So as you can see here, it outperformed HyperNEAT, which is an extension in SARSA. In addition, at the time, so NEAT was made in around 2002, it outperformed all other neural network methods in the cartpool environment. And it still does very, very well in cartpool. Now I want to go over more into extensions of NEAT. So NEAT is a very old algorithm that was created in around 2002. And since then, there have been many extensions made, and one of the most famous ones is called CPPN-NEAT, or Compositional Pattern Producing Networks. And what CPPNs do is that they allow networks to evolve their activation functions alongside their nodes and connections. So instead of just adding node genes and connection genes, now you have genes that control the activation functions of each node, and because of this variety of activation functions, you can actually create some pretty cool patterns, like these pictures of like a car and a skull and a dolphin, because of these variety of functions. And the motivation for this is in biology or anatomy, there are many examples of repeating patterns in the anatomy of animals, and this just allows us to capture some of those patterns and those structures. And then there's HyperNEAT. So HyperNEAT is an extension that allows networks to evolve as a function of a problem's geometry. And what this means is that they can evolve their weights and their connections with information about what the problem looks like. So as a bit more of an explanation, here's a chessboard. So we know that a chessboard is organized onto this square, and HyperNEAT can see this square, and it knows the position of each piece relative to each other. This is actually a checkers board, sorry. And it knows the position of each piece relative to each other. So in a way, it can actually see the problem it's trying to solve and use the geometry of the problem to help it solve the problem. And it can also be thought of as a 3D neural network, because the neurons are located in 3D space on planes called substrates, and they can be connected to the inputs in 3D space. So yeah, that was just an overview of neuroevolution. Thanks for watching.